This is the story of How Orm mandolins, wonderful but unusual instruments made in the late 1890s and early 1900s. It's also the story of the people who made them. The story spans a century and a quarter and intersects with some pretty interesting individuals. I hope you enjoyed the story. I'm Bob DeVellis, and I'll be telling it to you. My interest in How Orm mandolins spans about 20 years. I'm not a musician, but I've always been interested in music, and for most of my adult life, I've had fretted instruments. I grew up in the Boston area in the 1960s, and it was hard not to be interested in music in that time and place. The Boston-Cambridge folk scene was very active. In fact, Joan Baez went to my high school, although she was there before I was. I lived just a short distance from Boston and adjacent to Cambridge. I could see the Boston skyline and the John Hancock Tower from my bedroom window. I spent my career as a professor here in North Carolina, but my teaching and research had absolutely nothing to do with history, music, musical instruments, or anything like that. It's really been just a personal interest. But one thing that being an academic taught me is to dig into things. When I become interested in something, I want to learn as much about it as I can, and that's been the case with How Orm mandolins. I even got a couple of them, and I've spent many hours in the Boston Public Library going through old city directories and music trade publications, among other things. Really anything I could find that had any information at all about the Elias Howe Company or How Orm mandolins. I've also benefited greatly from the knowledge of others. In recent years, there have really been 4 people who know quite a bit about How Orm mandolins. I think I'm one of them. A second is Greg Miner, a third is Lowell Levenger, and a fourth is Rick Turner. I'll tell you something about each of them shortly. Another person whose scholarship has greatly influenced my work is Patrick Sky. He's not interested so much in the How Orm mandolins per se, but in Elias Howe. And again, I'll tell you more about him shortly. So let's begin with Greg Miner. Greg is the founder of the Miner Museum of Musical Instruments. This is a collection of rare and unusual instruments, really beautiful ones, that you can find online, and it's very much worth your time looking at it. In addition to his work with the museum, Greg is a performer, and he has put out several CDs. He has a wonderful collection of Christmas CDs using the instruments from his museum. Highly recommended. Greg has also been a moving force in the reemergence of interest in harp guitars. And once again, he has some recordings on harp guitars that are also highly recommended. Lowell Levenger was a student at Boston University in the 60s, and that was where he first encountered How Orm instruments. Boston, as I said, had a very active music scene during that period, and Lowell was a musician and soon gravitated to other musicians and got involved in a number of bands. Lowell's nickname is Banana, and a lot of people, in fact, know him as Banana. And he got that nickname from one of the bands he founded. It was called Banana and the Bunch, old-time music with appeal. But the band he's best known for being a part of was the Youngbloods. The Youngbloods had a #5 Billboard chart hit with Get Together in 1969. A great song and really an anthem for the late 60s and early 70s. Lowell went on to found Players Vintage Instruments. His emphasis is on instruments for players, not pristine, put them behind glass museum pieces, but real instruments that real players can enjoy. It's a great site to look at if you're just interested in vintage instruments, and certainly if you're looking to buy one. Rick Turner grew up in Massachusetts. He moved away but returned to the area to go to college. He was also a student at Boston University in the early 60s, and in fact, he roomed with Lowell Levenger. That's also where he first encountered Howarm instruments. Like his roommate Lowell, Rick Turner got caught up in the music scene in the Boston area in the early 60s, spent time playing with a lot of people, was the guitar accompanist for a Canadian duo called Ian and Sylvia, who had a hit record with Four Strong Winds. He was hanging around local music shops, looking over the shoulders of the repair guys, getting a real feel for the kinds of work they did. He eventually apprenticed as a repair person, and his interest grew and grew, and he became not only an expert repair person, but also an expert builder. He eventually founded Renaissance Guitars. He worked on, improved, built, maintained guitars for such notable performers as the Grateful Dead, Lindsey Buckingham, and David Crosby. Rick also was an author and did a lot of writing for guitar journals and publications. For example, he wrote both a regular column and served as an associate editor for Acoustic Guitar magazine. Greg and I wrote an article about Howarm instruments, and we submitted it to Fretboard Journal. The journal was interested and did decide to publish it. And they invited Rick to write a preface for the article, knowing that he was someone else who really knew a lot about the Howarm instruments. Rick felt that the instruments deserved a lot more attention than they were generally receiving. And in addition to writing the preface, he felt that there should be an exhibit of some sort. So he contacted the Museum of Making Music, which is part of NAMM, and he urged them to put on a Howarm exhibit. And they did. They agreed to the idea, and they invited Rick, Lowell, Greg, and I to be speakers. We also had a chance to field questions from the audience about these instruments and play together on Howarm instruments. The name of the exhibit was Howarm: Forgotten Voices Remembered. And a reprint of the article that Greg and I wrote served as a program for the exhibit. Patrick Sky is another person whose work has influenced me, and also a great friend. Pat was a folkie back in the early 60s.
Pat, you're best known, really, for the good sense of humor you have.
Well, I'm in the kitchen, my baby's in the hall.
And played with many of the great musicians. He was Mississippi John Hurt's backup guitarist and producer. He shared the stage with all the luminaries from both the Greenwich Village and the Boston Cambridge folk scenes. He even managed to get mentioned in a song by his buddy Dave Van Ronk. A little bit later on in his career, he became interested in Irish traditional music. He and his wife, Kathy Sky, went to Ireland so that Pat could study uilleann pipes under Leo Rosem, a very famous piper. He came back to this country, was a co-founder of Green Linnet Records, which was a major label for Irish traditional music, and also started to pursue a degree in cultural studies here in North Carolina. For work on his master's in cultural studies, he was examining old collections of fiddle tunes that had been assembled in decades past and handed down from generation to generation. And among those was a collection that Elias Howe had put together. Elias had sourced the tunes from other people who had done some of the collecting, and some of the collecting he had done himself. Pat took copies of all the manuscripts of tunes and digitally cleaned them, put them in great shape, assembled them all, we're talking about over 1,000 tunes, and brought them to Mel Bay publishers to see if they might be interested in putting them out as a book. They were, and it was published as Ryan's Mammoth Collection. In addition to the tunes, there were several prefatory sections to the book, And one of those was a biography of Elias Howe that Pat wrote. And I've drawn heavily on information from that. So the information I'll be presenting today is based on 20 years of my own research into Howe Orme mandolins, plus all the extensive knowledge that I've gleaned from Greg, Rick, Lowell, and Pat. And there are a few other people I'll mention as we go along who also contributed important pieces of information. Very sadly, both Rick and Pat have recently passed away. Pat in 2021 and Rick just this year, 2022. I only met Rick the one time when we all got together in Carlsbad, California for the Howe Orme exhibition at the Museum of Making Music. But even in that brief encounter and through our correspondence, I really came to value him. He was an incredible person, extremely generous with his time and knowledge. His many, many contributions will go on to be recognized. Patrick I knew much better. He was a friend. He and his wife lived only a few miles from my house while he lived in Chapel Hill. And I had the opportunity to share food and drinks and conversation and music with Patrick, as well as his wife, Kathy. So this is a much more personal loss. His presence will be sorely missed. So what was the world like in 1897? Well, things were very different. Over in Britain, Queen Victoria was still the ruler, and the Jack the Ripper murders were only a little bit more than a decade old, so they were still fresh in people's minds. Over here, the United States was also a very different place than it is now. The 45th state, Utah, had just been admitted to the Union the year before. In addition to the 45 states, the United States comprised 4 territories within the boundaries of the lower portion of the United States. Those territories were the Arizona Territory, New Mexico Territory, Oklahoma Territory, and Indian Territory. The Oklahoma Territory and Indian Territory eventually combined to form the state of Oklahoma. There was also a non-contiguous territory, and that was Alaska. Hawaii, which we think of as part of the United States now, was still an independent republic in 1897. The United States had no ownership claim to Hawaii whatsoever at that time. The Wild West was still really a recent memory, and there were vestiges of the Wild West that still existed in 1897. A lot of the figures we associate with that time were still alive. For example, Wyatt Earp, Bat Masterson, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, Calamity Jane, Annie Oakley, Buffalo Bill, and Geronimo were all still alive in 1897. Obviously, there was no web, no social media, no television, no broadcast radio, no movie theaters. Some people were wealthy enough to afford tickets to concerts or theatrical performances, but for the most part, when people entertained one another, they did so by playing music informally in their homes or in other places of gathering. So music was a much more, in part, when I say music, I mean making music, not just passively listening to music. Making music was a much more active and vital part of people's lives in 1897 than it is today. Most of the events of this story take place in Boston, so let's talk about what Boston was like back in the 1890s and even earlier. Although most people don't realize it, Boston was really a hotbed of musical activity back in the day. When you think of American cities associated with music today, Los Angeles, New York, Nashville, those are the places that come immediately to mind. But back then, Boston would very well be one of the cities that would spring to mind most readily when you were thinking about music. The first piece of music published in America is a book of psalms in 2-part harmony that was published in Boston way back in the 1600s. Now, Boston was founded by Puritans, so it's not surprising that a lot of the music that first appeared was sacred music. But certainly by 1800, there was a lot of secular music appearing in Boston as well. In 1820, a young man named Oliver Ditson was looking for work and gravitated to a music publishing house. He learned a lot there and would go on to found one of the major music publishing houses in the country, the Oliver Ditson Company. As the company grew, he would send his sons or other members of his staff to various locations to set up satellite offices. His sons, for example, opened offices in New York and Philadelphia, and a couple of employees went to Chicago to scout out the possibility of opening shop there, and they ended up founding the Lyon and Healy Company, which continues to this day as a major music outlet. Another spin-off of the Oliver Ditson Company was the John C. Haynes Company. Haynes was an employee of Ditson's who rose to considerable prominence in his own right, and they decided that he should open a separate entity associated with the Ditson firm that would be devoted to the manufacture and sales of musical instruments rather than focusing primarily on music publication. The John C. Haynes Company would go on to make instruments under the labels of Haynes, Bay State, Excelsior, and Tilton, among others. Another big music company in Boston at the time was the Vega Company. The Vega Company was primarily an instrument manufacturing firm, so it was more parallel to the John C. Haynes division of Oliver Ditson than to Oliver Ditson as a whole, because the latter was heavily involved in publishing. Vega was such a successful company that it kept absorbing other companies in the Boston area. Directly or indirectly, Vega ended up absorbing the Cole Banjo Company, Cole and Fairbanks, the A.C. Fairbanks Company, and eventually even Haynes itself. All of those companies were involved with fretted instruments. Vega also absorbed Thompson and Odell, which primarily produced band instruments. So it was very, very successful, quite acquisitive, and it had manufacturing facilities throughout Boston. In addition to Haynes and Vega, which were the biggest operations for making instruments, there were many, many smaller and even individually run manufacturing sites for fretted instruments. A woman named Ayers did her master's thesis on the history of instrument making in Boston, and she documented more than 130 instrument builders in Boston in the time period from the 1600s up until the 1930s, when she was working on her graduate degree. So there was a lot of activity going on, and there was a lot of interchange among these companies. Many of these companies used the same suppliers. Personnel from the companies would move from one place to another. It's not unusual to find a new company that was founded by someone who had previously worked for one of the other companies. That's a very common thread in the history of Boston instrument making. So there was an awful lot going on. Although it's less relevant to our interests today, there was also a great deal of musical performance going on. There were concert halls from a very early date, again, starting with sacred music, but then moving into secular music. So Boston was really a hub of musical activity. Let's turn our attention to the Boston music company we're really interested in, which is the Elias Howe Company. Well, not surprisingly, it was founded by Elias Howe. So let's talk about him a little bit. Elias was an interesting guy. He grew up in rural Massachusetts. He worked as a farm laborer. He had learned to play violin and wanted to broaden his repertoire. So he started wandering around finding local New England musicians, listening to their violin playing, learning the tunes they were playing, and as best he could, jotting down the notation to preserve the tunes. He did this quite extensively, and he started to accrue quite a collection of these tunes. At some point, it occurred to him that these tunes might be of use to other people and that perhaps he could get them published. So he approached a publisher in Boston, showed them his tunes, and asked if they would be interested in publishing them. They said, yeah, they'd be delighted to publish them, but it would cost $500 that Howe would have to pay to them to make up the plates and assume some of the other costs of publishing. Well, there's no way that this young man from rural Massachusetts could come up with $500 to get his tune collection published. But he managed to convince the people at Kidder and Wright that if they would take a chance with him, he would make good. He would see to it that they turned a profit. He must have been very persuasive because they decided to give it a shot. And sure enough, he was true to his word. He actually went door to door, went to various music shops, and sold them on the idea of buying these books. He was so successful, in fact, that he was able to use the money he earned from it to buy the music printing plates back from the publishers. Having had that initial success in Boston, he decided in 1845 to move there. And 5 years later, in 1850, he had even more tunes and other types of things that he thought might be of use to a publisher. So he went to the big house in town, that is to say, Oliver Ditson, and asked them if they would be interested in publishing his tune collections. Again, they said they were, but they had some stipulations. First, of course, they would own rights to all the tunes. And perhaps more importantly, he had to agree to desist from music publication for a period of 10 years. They didn't want to be in competition with him. So he agreed to those terms, and during those 10 years, from 1850 to 1860, he didn't engage in any music publishing. But that didn't stop him from collecting tunes. So during that time period, he continued to collect tunes. When 1860 rolled around, he was no longer bound by his commitment to the Ditson Company to avoid any publishing activities. So he was back in business, and he founded the Elias Howe Company. He was also a person of some prominence by this time. He had been making good money from his various activities. In addition to the tune collections, he had also put together lots of tutorials teaching people how to play a whole host of instruments: violin, mandolin, concertina, and others. And these revenue streams had done pretty well for him. He'd also opened a small factory to make drums, and he was selling drums that he made, fifes that he was able to source from another builder, and instruction manuals on fife and drum ensembles. And he was selling all these products to the state militias in Massachusetts, who often had fife and drum groups within them as a way of marketing themselves to their communities and demonstrating their professionalism. He also had made friends with Henry Wilson, who was one of the 2 U.S. senators from Massachusetts. So he had risen to considerable prominence at this point. The following year, 1861, Fort Sumter was attacked and the Civil War began. Although that was a national disaster, it actually opened up some opportunities for Elias Howe because of his involvement in musical products used by the military. Obviously, militias became much more prevalent and prominent as the war started to gear up. Also, his friend, Senator Henry Wilson, was appointed as chair of the committee that had oversight for many of the war activities. So Elias was well connected to what was going on nationally with regard to the war. His musical activities were also well known. And in fact, President Abraham Lincoln invited him to serve as director of the U.S. Army Bands. And along with that would come a commission as lieutenant colonel. But Elias declined. He decided that publishing music and selling music products was more in line with his interests. I said earlier that there were a couple of other people that I would mention as I went along who provided me with information. One of those was Chuck Richards. Chuck is the great-great-grandson of Elias Howe, and I had the opportunity to correspond with him and his wife and also to speak to him by phone. And they had some really interesting little tidbits, not only the kind of information that was available from other sources, but some family inside track stuff that was really quite interesting. And some of that related to the friendship between Senator Wilson and Elias Howe. and a particular offshoot of that friendship. Senator Wilson would occasionally send Elias Howe copies of the Congressional Record. And on one occasion, the copies never showed up. Well, it turned out that there were two Elias Howes living in the same town at the same time. One, obviously, is the music guy we've been talking about. The other was the person who invented the sewing machine, also named Elias Howe. In fact, the latter was probably the more prosperous and the more famous because of his invention of the sewing machine. Both knew of the other, but apparently they didn't interact very much. When the music guy went over to the sewing machine guy and said, "Hey, where's my mail? I want my mail." The sewing machine guy refused to give it to him. So from that point on, their relationship was even more sour than it had been prior to that. An important element of that little anecdote is that there was always confusion between the two. There were these two prominent men, both named Elias Howe Jr., both living in Massachusetts and at some points in time virtually in the same town. From then to the present, there has been confusion about which one was which and whether there were two or one Elias Howes. This brings us to a story involving the Beatles and George Harrison in particular. If you watch the credits for the movie Help, as they start to roll, there's a dedication. And the scrolling text says something to the effect of, "This movie is dedicated to Elias Howe, the inventor of the sewing machine." Well, why on earth would the Beatles dedicate their movie to the inventor of the sewing machine? Well, there may be an explanation. Rumor has it that George Harrison bought a Howe-Orm mandolin. As the rumor goes, he walked into McCabe's music shop in Santa Monica, California, saw one, and snatched it up. Well, why would he do that? There's a possible explanation. George was a huge fan of the ukulele. In fact, George, John, and Paul all played ukulele at various times. But George was the biggest fan by far. His interest in ukuleles was described as an obsession. He would be traveling in Hawaii, would go to every music store he could find and buy up their complete inventory of ukuleles, bring them back home, give them to friends, and keep some for himself. He was a ukulele evangelist. So imagine his walking into this music store and seeing this beautiful little ukulele-sized, guitar-shaped, which means ukulele-shaped, instrument. There were no guitar-shaped mandolins prior to the Howe-Orms. There were some after that, but they never really caught on. In fact, the Howe-Orms never really caught on in as big a way as, let's say, the Gibsons. So not many people would recognize a small guitar-shaped instrument as something other than a ukulele. I can remember visiting music stores. I can remember one occasion, I think it was in New Jersey, going into a music store and seeing not a Howe-Orm, but another guitar-shaped mandolin that was actually kind of an imitation of a Howe-Orm. And I knew what it was. I knew it was a mandolin. I was familiar with that particular brand of instrument. But just for laughs, I went over to the store owner, mandolin in hand, and said, "Gee, what is this?" And he said, "Oh, that's a taro patch." Well, a taro patch is an 8-string ukulele. So even people in the music sales business would often mistake something like a Howe-Orm instrument for an 8-string ukulele.
They are not ukuleles. They're often thought to be, but they're not. They're 8-string mandolins.
And there are, in addition to taro patches, there are other 8-string ukuleles that are just called ukuleles. So George Harrison may very well have seen this 8-string instrument and just assumed it was a ukulele. It may have even been strung with gut strings, because if one of these instruments came into inventory, whoever received it may have just assumed it was a ukulele and strung it appropriately. So there is certainly a possibility that George thought this was a ukulele. If he did, he undoubtedly would have been interested in it, because these instruments are very well made to a very high standard with beautiful appointments. and a unique design. So it's something that would have appealed to him very strongly. Now, we don't know that this is exactly what happened. Several pieces of this story are speculation, but I think that it's at least a plausible speculation. And the rumor certainly persists that George did in fact buy this Howard instrument. So let's assume that our speculation is true, that George did in fact go into McCabe's music, saw this beautiful Howard instrument, assumed it was a ukulele, which very much piqued his interest. He peered inside, looked at the label. It said Elias Howe Company, Boston. Well, he may have already known about someone named Elias Howe, or he may have done some digging to find out who this Elias Howe was, since he didn't know of any other Elias Howe instruments. And what he would have found if he went digging for information on Elias Howe was information about the Elias Howe who made the sewing machine, because there was a lot more information about him available then and now as compared to the Elias Howe involved in the music industry. So he may have gone to his fellow Beatles and said, let's honor this wonderful instrument by putting a dedication to Elias Howe, but let's do it in kind of a clever way. And instead of honoring him for his involvement in music, let's say that we're honoring him for his invention of the sewing machine. And the sewing machine's a wonderful invention, and even though it doesn't have any direct bearing on us or on our story, let's tongue-in-cheek, let's do it that way. That seems like a very Beatles-esque way of honoring Elias Howe. There's an irony. As the camera pans back, a sewing machine comes into focus, but it's a Singer sewing machine, not an Elias Howe. Now, part of the reason for that very well may be that there aren't probably that many Elias Howe sewing machines around anymore, and there are Singer sewing machines all over the place. But still, it's kind of an irony. Let's deviate just a little bit more and talk about the Singer guy, Isaac Merritt Singer, because he's a very colorful character. Isaac Singer was an extraordinary womanizer. He had women all over the place that he considered wives. He would float from one resident to another, each equipped with one of these women who was virtually his wife. There was confusion about who his actual wife was at any period in time. And at one point, one of his wives was riding down the street in a carriage, and she looked over to a carriage that was approaching, and what did she see but her husband Isaac with another woman in that other carriage. Well, she decided this was just disgraceful and embarrassing and that she had to do something about it, so she contacted the authorities and pressed charges. So Isaac Singer was arrested for bigamy. He was a very wealthy man, so he was able to get out on bail. He jumped bail. Having jumped bail, he took one of his girlfriends/wives, hopped on a ship, and sailed to England, where he spent the rest of his life. Once he got to England, he met yet another woman, 30 years younger than he was. Her name was Isabella Boyer, and he married her. There's a long-standing rumor that she was the model who posed for the Statue of Liberty. This rumor has been pretty much discredited, and if you look at a picture of her and a picture of the face of the Statue of Liberty, it seems like a bit of a stretch to say that they're one and the same. So I think we can dismiss that rumor, but it's still an interesting story. Okay, enough for the digressions. Let's get back to our main theme, the Elias Howe Company. Elias Howe was stricken by a bout of paralysis in 1887, and he experienced a recurrence in 1891. So he was getting on in years and was not a well man, and he realized that he had to relinquish control of the Elias Howe Company. And so he really turned it over to his children, William, Edward, and Harriet Howe. William really was the guy in charge for the most part. Edward served as treasurer, and Harriet was secretary for the company. Finally, in 1896, Elias Howe passed away. So to recap Elias's life, He grew up poor but enterprising, managed to find ways of getting music published, managed to accrue both wealth and influence through his hard work. He founded a music company that sold both sheet music and a wide variety of musical instruments. Elias eventually became ill and eventually passed in 1896. If you've been paying careful attention, you may have noticed that I said the birth of Howe Orm mandolin was 1897, but the death of Elias Howe was 1896. So Elias Howe really wasn't involved with these instruments, although his company was under the leadership of his children. The instruments actually had their origin up in Ottawa, Canada. A company up there called J.L. Orm & Son was kind of a mirror image of the Elias Howe Company in some respects. It's a company that produced a large amount of sheet music, but was also involved in selling musical instruments. Although its emphasis was primarily pianos, and that seemed to become a greater emphasis as time passed, they also sold stringed instruments, and in fact, they manufactured string instruments. They had someone working for them by the name of James Back. Back is what would have been called back then a mechanic. Today we would call him a luthier, an instrument builder. But back then, pretty much anyone who worked with their hands would have been called a mechanic. And Back was a very clever and ingenious guy. The 1893 Howe Orm guitar patent lists him as the inventor of the guitar. By the time we get to the 1897 mandolin patent, however, he's not mentioned, and one of the Howe sons, Edward, is listed as the inventor. How did that transition take place? Well, there's a newspaper clipping from 1896 that tells the story. It notes that the instruments made prior by the J.L. Orm & Son Company in their space above their piano warehouses had been transferred to the Elias Howe Company of Boston. It also mentions that these instruments have received great praise, even from their competitors. Another point worth noting is that by this time, J.L. Orm was also deceased, and his son George Orm was in charge of the J.L. Orm Company. So the transfer of ownership for what would become the Howe Orm instruments was a transaction between the son of J.L. Orm's founder and the children of Elias Howe Company's founder. Neither of the founders of the two organizations were alive and obviously thus weren't involved in this transaction. Let's talk about some of the distinguishing features of a Howe Orm mandolin. One we've already mentioned, and probably the thing that people would first notice, is that it's shaped like a guitar. It looks like a miniature, perfectly proportioned guitar body. I've speculated that if George Harrison did indeed buy one of them, that is probably one of the factors that caught his eye, thinking it was a ukulele. Another even more important feature of the instruments is that they have what is referred to as a longitudinal bulge or longitudinal hump on the top plate, the soundboard of the instrument. This is a bulge that runs from the very top end of the body, where the neck joins the body, all the way down to the tail end, where the strings attach to the tailpiece. It's unusual for sure, but it's also more than just an aesthetic identifying feature. It actually has structural significance. If you've ever driven down the road and passed a flatbed truck that doesn't have a load, you may have noticed that the flatbed isn't flat, it's actually convex. It humps upwards. That's because that's a very strong design, and when you put a load on that flatbed, it's more capable of supporting it because it began in a convex orientation. The same is true for the top of a musical instrument. Strings create downforce that pushes down on the top, and it's that downforce that transmits the sound from the strings to the instrument. Having a strong top is thus very important. A domed top, because it's inherently stronger, allows an instrument to be designed with a lighter, more responsive, thinner top, and potentially also to carry somewhat heavier strings. And those two features, especially in unison, will result in a louder, more responsive instrument. Another noteworthy feature of Howe Orm mandolins is their fancy pickguards. From the simplest to the most elaborate model, all have these pickguards. They're tortoise shell, and they're inlaid with decoration consisting of white outlined with black. Most of that inlay represents a kind of complex vine shape, but in the center, there are actually letters. There's a stylized E with a stylized H superimposed over it, and a stylized C below it with an O tucked into the center of the C. And those letters, EHCO, obviously stand for the Elias Howe Company. Another unusual feature of these mandolins is their peg heads. The peg heads are narrow, and in some cases they're actually narrower at the far end than they are at the near end. This is another feature that is more than just aesthetic. Having the farthest tuning posts closer to the center line of the instrument allows the strings to follow a straighter path as they go from the tuning posts, through the slots in the nut, and on down toward the bridge. When the angle is more acute, there's a tendency for the strings to bind in those slots, and tuning the instrument properly becomes more difficult. Gibson would make a big deal out of this so-called innovation in the 20s when they came out with their snakehead style of headstock. But this is actually something that the Howe Orm instruments had considerably earlier. As a matter of fact, Gibson would also make a big deal out of their dome-topped instruments, and they would cite Stradivarius as their inspiration. But again, that's something that Howe Orm had put into mandolins before Gibson. Another question people often ask, I've asked it myself many times, is who built these? Who actually built these? Where were these actually physically manufactured? The reason that question comes up is because we have extensive records of lots of building facilities. I talked about the Ayers Masters paper, a book really, that documented 130 builders of musical instruments in the Boston area. Whereas for many of these companies, manufacturing sites are mentioned. There doesn't seem to be any record of a Elias Howe Company factory for the manufacture of these mandolins. So where were they built? Well, we know the very earliest mandolins prior to the actual transfer of ownership, and actually prior to the, probably in some cases prior to the 1897 patent date. Some of those came from Ottawa. And in fact, there are existing instruments that look exactly like every other Howe Orm instruments, except that they have labels that say J.L. Orm, and they have a pickguard logo that also represents the J.L. Orm Company rather than the Elias Howe Company. So I guess one possibility we need to consider is that they continued to manufacture Howe Orm instruments and ship them down to the Elias Howe Company, and they sold them and distributed them. That doesn't seem very likely, though. There was a trade tariff that banned the import of foreign instruments into Canada. And this dated from the 1870s, the late 1870s. It didn't ban export from Canada to the United States, but it seems like United States merchants may not have been that eager to import from Canada when they were unable to export to Canada. Also, it just seems like a fairly impractical arrangement to have them built in one country, ship them across a border, and down into Boston from Ottawa. That just seems like a cumbersome arrangement. So I don't think that's what happened. Okay, so the alternative is that someone in the United States, probably in Boston, was actually manufacturing. In fact, there may have been multiple someones. So we have to consider who that one or more companies may have been. Well, the two main contenders, I suppose, are the Haynes Company and the Vega Company, because they were the ones that had the big factories. So let's consider each of those possibilities. Whoever it was, they would have needed some kind of fancy equipment to build these instruments. These instruments differed markedly from other mandolins being made in Boston by other companies. They were shaped like guitars, very different shape than other mandolins. And they had this domed top with this longitudinal bulge. And it wouldn't have been easy for existing manufacturers to create either of those. They would have had to do some tooling up. Now, one possibility is that the tooling that the J.L. Orm Company got transferred to the Elias Howe Company along with the rights to the instrument. Those tools wouldn't have had much value to J.L. Orm if they were not going to be making the instruments anymore, and they would have had considerable value to the Elias Howe Company. So I think there's a good chance that at least one set of those tools and dies and patterns came down to Boston. But who did they go to? Did the Elias Howe Company keep them and maybe take over some space in a Haynes or Vega factory for a few months out of the year or a few weeks out of the year, crank out a bunch of instruments, bring them to the warehouse, and then clear out? That's certainly a possibility. I think a greater possibility is that the Elias Howe Company just contracted with one of these companies to build for them. Both Haynes and Vega built instruments for other companies. They built instruments for sale under different labels than their own. So this wouldn't have been a strange thing for them to do. Of the two candidates, I think Vega is the stronger contender for the folks who were building these mandolins. Now, it's possible that, as I said, that more than one builder was used, and that's somewhat consistent with the fact that the number sequence for these instruments is really kind of crazy. There seem to be numbers that run sequentially, and then there'll be a huge jump to a different number sequence. So it's possible that there were different manufacturers at different times who were essentially using some numbering system of their own invention. But I still think that Vega is the lead contender for most of these instruments, and I'll give you some reasons why. First, as I've said, they had the capacity. They had lots of square footage of factory space in Boston, and they built for other companies. They also had the know-how. When the A.C. Fairbanks Banjo Company caught fire in 1904, Vega bought it up. And one of the things they acquired as part of that deal was the services of a very talented Fairbanks employee by the name of David L. Day. Day was an extremely creative designer and an excellent manager of manufacturing. While at Fairbanks, he played a critical role in the development of the White Lady and Tubaphone banjos, two of their most iconic designs. Someone like him would have been very capable of setting up a manufacturing line to produce an entirely new type of mandolin. Now, he wasn't there until 1904, as far as we know, although, as I've mentioned, people moved back and forth a bit between various companies, so he may have had some communication with the Vega Company even before the fire at Fairbanks. We don't know that. But their capacity and his talent are certainly things that would have made it easier for Vega to produce Howe-Orm mandolins, perhaps, than some other companies. Another argument leaning toward Vega as a producer is the fact that some years later, Vega actually came out with a mandolin design that had a bulge, a longitudinal bulge. It was on the back of the instrument, however, not the front, and those are called cylinder back mandolins. Very nice instruments. Now, I suppose it's possible that David L. Day, who's credited with inventing the cylinder back design, could have just seen a Howe-Orm mandolin somewhere and said, gee, maybe we could apply this idea to the back of the instrument. But if he had been intimately involved with the manufacturer of Howe-Orm instruments, he may have been in a greater position to appreciate the benefits of that kind of structural design and have been willing to experiment with applying it to the back of the instrument. So that seems to suggest that maybe Vega is the company that made these instruments. Another thread of indirect evidence is the similarity of some of the inlays that you find on Vega instruments and Howwarm instruments. Companies like Martin bought guitar inlays in bulk from sources in Germany, and they were all pre-cut. Vega, on the other hand, hired Italian artisans who had great skill at carving and engraving to cut and engrave their inlays. The most famous person of that sort was a man named Icilio Consalvi, who worked for Vega. He produced some of the most stunning presentation-grade banjos ever to be built. The inlays I've seen on Howwarm mandolins aren't up to the standards of Consalvi's best work, but Consalvi also hired other people in the area and trained them to do inlay work for Vega. So it's very possible that the inlays we see on Howwarm mandolins that look kind of like inlays we see on Vega instruments are the result of the fact that the same people in the same factory were carving and engraving both. The last piece of circumstantial evidence came to me by way of Tony Creamer. Tony Creamer owns a music shop in Amherst, Massachusetts. And I was in there one day, and this was around the time that Greg and I were working on our article that eventually appeared in the Fretboard Journal. So I got talking with Tony and we were swapping stories, and I started talking about Howwarm mandolins, and he said, well, wait a second. And he went and got a Howwarm mandolin that he had that he was in the process of trying to get back into playing order. And we exchanged ideas, and I asked him who he thought built these instruments. And he looked at me and said, Vega, without a doubt. And I was kind of taken aback by his certainty, and I asked him why he was so confident that they were the builder. And he said, you know, I've looked at lots of instruments, tons of Vega instruments I've had apart. I've had apart several Howwarm mandolins, and there were just some certain similarities. The neck joint, he said, is exactly the same. It's not the most common type of neck joint, and the way that it appears on a Vega mandolin is identical to the way it appears on a Howwarm mandolin, and it's just really hard for me to believe that they are not made by the same people in the same factory. So that is a fairly persuasive bit of evidence from a knowledgeable source. Now, all of these threads of evidence, the fact that Vega had the capacity and the talent, the fact that they ended up producing their own longitudinally bulged instrument, the similarity of the inlays, and the similarity of the neck joints and other structural components, those are all circumstantial, but collectively they build a pretty strong case. Also, there really is no similar case pointing to anyone else for having built these. We don't see any evidence to suggest that Haynes or a bunch of independent builders or someone else other than Vega was involved in the construction of Howwarm mandolins. We may never know definitively whether or not Vega was in fact the builder, but I think the available evidence thus far certainly puts them in the position of being the leading candidate. Most people have never heard of Howwarm mandolins. And when you try to explain to them that these are like really great mandolins, these are really, beautiful, well-built, good-sounding mandolins, they wonder why they haven't heard of them, and they wonder who played them. For many instruments, even going back to the early years of the 20th century, you can point to a famous person who played and endorsed them. For example, Vega had a guy named Pittini, a concert mandolinist of great fame, who played their bowlback instruments. And people talk about the Pittini model Vega mandolin, and they say, well, I don't know much about bowlbacks, but I understand that this famous guy named Pittini played a Vega, and I've never heard anything like that about Howwarm. Well, part of the reason for that is that there doesn't appear ever to have been any kind of artist endorsement arrangement between the Elias Howe Company and any performing artists. That's actually kind of unusual. Martin certainly had endorsers. Gibson had many endorsers. Vega had endorsers. It was quite common. Now, perhaps because the Elias Howe Company sold such a wide range of products. Not only one or two lines of musical instruments, but many types of musical instrument, sheet music, accessories, all kinds of stuff. Maybe for that reason, they didn't see a sufficiently large segment of their business arising from these Howard mandolins. In fact, if you look at catalogs from the period, the catalogs run to about 100 pages, and only about 6 pages are dedicated to Howard instruments. So in the grand scheme of things, they weren't a big part of the company's business. And consequently, they may not have justified the costs and commitments of enlisting endorsers. So without those endorsers and without advertisements touting them as players of Howard instruments, it's hard to know exactly who it was that was playing these instruments back in the day. I would venture to guess that it wasn't casual mandolin enthusiasts, and I say that based on the cost of these instruments. Using the Elias Howe Company catalog as a basis, these were expensive instruments. You could buy from that catalog an entry-level bowlback mandolin for about $5. If you wanted the most sensational bowlback mandolin, a Superbo model, it was called, which was an Elias Howe brand, so the best Elias Howe bowlback you could find, that cost a bit over $67. The rock bottom price for a Howe Warm instrument, and this is for a mahogany bodied model, whereas all the others are Brazilian rosewood, but that kind of entry level model, that was over $16, which is well above the price of other entry level mandolins. On the other hand, if you went up to the top end of the line, the very best Howe Warm mandolin in the catalog cost a very substantial $80. That was a lot of money back in the early 1900s when this catalog was produced. So these aren't instruments that someone brought home and gave to their kid who they thought might like to learn mandolin. These were instruments primarily for professionals or very serious amateurs. Now, amateurs don't generally leave much of a record of what kinds of instruments they used, unless you find someone's diary where they said, you know, I've been playing mandolin low these many years and I decided to get something really nice, so I bought a Howe Warm mandolin. I've never encountered anything like that, and there may be no such thing in existence. The one type of amateur whose activities were better preserved were musicians involved in university music ensembles. These groups got photographed for yearbooks, and yearbooks tend to be saved. They're typically printed on higher quality paper than regular newsprint. So we do have evidence that many universities, especially those in New England, had music groups who were using Howe Warm instruments. So that's one category of amateur about whom we have information. These were serious amateurs in organized ensembles. So again, you would expect them to be using something better than a run-of-the-mill instrument. And if you look at the non-Howe Warm instruments that other members of the ensemble were using, they too are very good professional quality instruments. So the amateurs who were playing Howe Warm instruments that we know of were people playing at a serious level. We also know of some professionals who used Howe Warm. For example, a member of the Arion Mandolin Orchestra of Boston played a Howe Warm instrument, and we have a photograph of that. Similarly, the Hawthorne Music Club of Boston used a Howe Warm mandolin. And although it was called a music club, it was clearly a professional group based on the source from which this photo came and the fact that it's clearly a promotional photo for bookings. A duet by the name of Albert Hartley and Ed Gale had a photo taken for promotional purposes of them with their instruments. And one of them is seen to have Howe Warm mandolin family instrument. Clearly, this is a professional group who would have used this photo as a promotional tool. So they're professionals that we know used Howe Warm. But perhaps the best known professional to use a Howe Warm instrument was Myron Bickford. Myron Bickford was a rock star of his era. Bickford was a successful concert performer, educator, publisher, multi-instrumentalist. He was also the husband of an even more famous musician named Vada Alcott Bickford. And after their marriage, Myron changed his first name to Czar, becoming Czar Myron Bickford, married to his wife, Vada Alcott Bickford. Vada started life as Ethel Lucretia Alcott. So you may wonder, how do you go from an Ethel to a Vada and from a Myron to a Czar? Well, the answer is that both were interested in astrology, spirituality, and numerology. And apparently they felt that their first names were not numerologically optimal, so they chose alternate names for reasons of conformity with numerological standards that they felt were more desirable. Now, as I said, Vada was quite a force. She was referred to as the Grand Lady of the Guitar. Her career continued well into my lifetime. She was a Martin guitar endorser, and they built guitars to her specification for her use. Myron was also a Martin endorser. I don't know if he endorsed Martin mandolins, but he certainly endorsed Martin guitars. Despite his ties to Martin and his wife's very extensive ties to Martin, he was happy to have at least one promotional photograph taken with a Howarm mandolin in the picture. He would not have played an instrument that was anything less than an absolutely top quality, superb, professional grade instrument. He had a very strong reputation to maintain, and his choice of instrument certainly would have reflected that. So I think this points to the very high regard in which the Howarm instruments were regarded at that time. So how do these instruments sound and how do they play? Well, when Greg and I were working on the article, and for some time thereafter, we tried to assemble information on every extant Howarm mandolin family instrument we could find. And it was a difficult task, but we scoured the internet and we talked to people by word of mouth. We were able to identify, ultimately, just over 80 instruments of 4 types: mandolins, tenor mandolas, octave mandolas, and mandocellos. Those are the 4 sizes in which Howarm mandolin family instruments were manufactured. As a quick aside, the idea of a mandolin family of instruments is another idea that Gibson likes to take credit for, but that in fact Howarm beat them to the punch on. But let's get back to the fact that there are so few instruments around. Of the 83 we identified, we have photos of many of them, and a lot of them are not in playable condition. Some are not even intact. I think it's safe to say that virtually every Howarm mandolin that is in playable condition has been restored. Chuck Richards, the great-great-grandson of Elias Howe, actually has an instrument that was handed down through generations of the family. And one of the things he asked me when we were speaking is, where might he get it repaired, because the top had caved in. That's not an uncommon problem with actually lots of old instruments of the era. They were built with hide glue, and the joint where the neck fits into the body is held in place with this hide glue, and hide glue softens in the presence of heat and moisture. These instruments have been around for 1¼ centuries. That's lots of hot, damp summers in a New England basement or attic, and lots of opportunity for that glue to soften. As the glue softens, the tension of the strings pulls the neck forward. The neck pivots at the joint, and the extension of the fretboard gets pushed down into the top of the instrument above the sound hole. So cracks, major cracks, develop along the sides of the fingerboard. In some cases, they actually break right through and there's an actual hole. So even an instrument that was as revered and well cared for as Chuck's can undergo that kind of damage. And many people don't realize that there's a risk. And even if Chuck himself realized that there was a risk of damage, the damage almost certainly happened long before the instrument was in his possession. There was a century or so of time during which that could have happened when people weren't as attuned to the need to maintain proper temperature and humidity for instruments. So, how do they play? Well, there aren't that many of them that play, but the ones that have been properly restored to their original geometry can play very, very well. How do they sound? Well, when you talk about matters historical, you have to put things into the context of the time period. The context for these mandolins was the world of bowlback mandolins. They were the predominant form of mandolin at the time. Those instruments tend to sound quite bright, and to modern ears that can be kind of shrill, actually. That served them well in ensembles where other instruments were providing the fuller, lower end of the music range. And their brightness allowed their sound to cut through and be heard. The Howwarm instruments sound kind of like that. In very capable hands, a bowlback mandolin can sound better than it certainly does in my very uncapable hands. But inherent to that style of instrument is a certain amount of trebly shrillness. And there's a hint of that in the Howwarms. It may be a little less so than in most bowlbacks, but it's still there. There's actually a remedy for that. Howwarm instruments are small compared to modern instruments. So their mandolins are smaller than a modern mandolin. Their tenor mandola is smaller than a modern tenor mandola. And what some people do is they will actually take a tenor mandola and restring it with lighter gauge strings and tune it as a mandolin. Its scale length is actually kind of in between the scale length of a modern mandolin and a modern mandola. So as long as the strings aren't too heavy, you can do that safely. That provides a much fuller sounding instrument with less of that treble bite. And I think actually configured that way, that instrument compares very favorably with other instruments of its own era and even with many modern oval hole mandolins. I'll be comparing the Howwarm mandolin to several other instruments from that same time period, roughly. And I'll just say a little bit about the other instruments that I'll be presenting. One is a 1902 Style 5 Martin bowlback mandolin. The Style 5 was a very high-grade mandolin, and you can tell when you see it that it's a very fancy instrument. This was a really good instrument of its time. I'll also be comparing it to a 1913 Gibson A3 mandolin. The Gibson oval hole mandolins of that era really kind of defined the modern sound of oval hole mandolins. And to this day, the sound that most oval hole mandolins strive for is the sound of the Gibsons of the teens and 20s. So that's a representative of a more modern sounding mandolin, and you'll be able to hear the difference between it and the Howwarms. Another instrument from roughly the same period, the early teens, is a Vega cylinderback that I'll show you. This is actually the lowest end model of the cylinderbacks. It's mahogany rather than rosewood, and I actually prefer the sound of the mahogany mandolin. It has a little bit more clarity, and it still has a kind of warmth and mellowness that I like. The next instrument that I'll be comparing it to is quite different. It's a Martin employee mandolin. Let me explain what an employee instrument is. In the old days, Martin allowed its employees to build as many as one instrument a year for their own use. They could build it, they could keep it. They could use all the resources of the Martin factory, all the materials. They could have other personnel help them if the personnel were willing. The instruments couldn't carry any Martin branding, however. So it can be a little bit difficult verifying that an instrument that looks like an old Martin and has no Martin branding is actually an employee instrument. But I've done a pretty good job, I think, in this case. On the underside of the top, there's the signature of a man named Willis Werkheiser. As it turns out, the Werkheiser family has worked at Martin's factory for generations. I was able to be in touch with a member of the Werkheiser family who confirmed for me that Willis, their ancestor, had in fact made this mandolin. So this one has pretty good provenance. It was built probably around the time period between 1917 and 1919. I think it took that long because I think it was probably begun before US soldiers were involved in World War I and probably completed after their return. So my guess is that Willis's service was a source of delay in his finishing the instrument, and upon his return, he finally finished it up. The last instrument I'll be using for comparison is a bit later. It's from 1922, and it's another unusual style of mandolin from the Wyman Company of Philadelphia, and it's called a Wyman Mandolute, although it's clearly a mandolin. But it has some features that are a little bit different. This is probably a model or two up from the most basic model that Wyman made at the time. So it's sort of just above an entry level, I would say, but an interesting mandolin, and you'll have a chance to hear all of them. Howard mandolin from about 1897. Howard tenor mandola, also from about 1897. This is a Martin bowlback mandolin from about 1902. This is a Vega cylinderback mandolin. From about 1914. More modern sounding than the others. This is a Gibson A3 from 1913. This is the Martin employee mandolin from, let's call it 1918. Wyman lute mandolin. It's unusual in that the body is thickest at the bridge and thinner near the neck and near the tailpiece. And also the body, top and back hang over the sides a little bit in a manner reminiscent of a violin. Hartworm mandolin. People often wonder whether Hartworm mandolins are available. And there are some of them out there, but obviously not very many. We only know of 80 or so, I think 83 was the exact number, that have appeared over the past more than a decade. And we've been able to track some of them as they've gone through multiple hands, reappearing several times under different ownerships, but only being counted once in our list of instruments. So it's not like you can go into your local music store and have any hopes of finding a Hartworm mandolin. In fact, you probably can't go into even a very good music store that specializes in exotic instruments and have any hopes of finding one. But there are a few outlets. Players Vintage Instruments, which I mentioned before, that Lowell Levenger operates, is certainly one place I would look if I were looking for one. Lowell has probably one of the best collections of Hartworm mandolins in the country, and those mandolins are potentially for sale. Bernunzio Uptown Instruments is another place where I've seen them online. So it's possible to find them, but it takes some hunting. Whereas other instruments of that age, like maybe an old Gibson from the early 1900s, you might be able to buy from a private source. I would be very reluctant to do that with these Hartworms because They're not well understood, and as I said, there's a lot that can be wrong with them that wouldn't be evident until you really got your hands on it, and that may make it virtually impossible to play. My How Orm mandolin, when I first got it, had string action that was absurdly high, and it made the instrument virtually unplayable. I was able to get an outstanding local luthier by the name of Wes Lamb to do some repairs on it and put it in great shape. But had I not had some familiarity with stringed instruments and mandolins, I may just have thought, well, this is just a very, very hard mandolin to play because the neck angle had slipped badly and then the glue had resealed. So it wasn't wobbling back and forth, but it was stuck in a position that made the instrument almost unplayable. The intonation was horrific. And once that was all taken care of, it was really a wonderful instrument. But the mistake I made was buying it from a source other than someone who really knew about these instruments. So if you're on the hunt, I would probably start with people who know a lot about them, and Lowell Levenger would be high on that list. You also need to be prepared to spend a fair amount for these instruments. They're very scarce, they're high quality. Demand isn't sky high. Frankly, I think they're worth even more than the substantial prices that you'll see. But unlike an old Gibson, there aren't people who understand the instruments and crave them and hunt them down. Old Gibsons were just old Gibsons until Bill Monroe found one in a barber shop and created bluegrass music on it, and suddenly the price of those old instruments, even in a state of disrepair, went through the roof. Nothing like that has ever happened with How Orm instruments, and there are really very few people who understand them well. But to get a good one, you probably have to pay a fair amount. Is it possible? Yes. Is it easy? No. So to finish up, let's summarize things a bit. How Orm instruments are these really beautifully designed, beautifully executed instruments that use very premium materials and that were built to a very high standard. They came about as a collaboration between a Canadian designer originally and a Boston-based distributor, and probably a Boston-based manufacturer, the former being the Elias Howe Company and the latter perhaps being the Vega Company. They're good instruments. They've got a long history. That history spans back a century and a quarter. As we've seen, it intersects with some very interesting characters along the way. I've enjoyed telling you the story of these instruments, and I hope you've enjoyed listening to it.